do you get to know God? I grew up in church. I read the Bible from cover to cover and listened attentively to every sermon that was preached. And they were very long and chunky sermons. The result was that I knew a lot about God, but I knew him in the same way that you might know the King of England through the pages of a newspaper. So how do we actually get to know God? It's interesting to me that Jesus spoke of the religious experts of his day. They were known as the Pharisees, and Jesus said of them that they studied the scriptures more than anyone. They knew their theology and their knowledge really well, but Jesus said that they had never heard his voice. They were far from him. They didn't know him. So we know that it's not about just having a lot of knowledge. Knowledge is good. Theology is good. Reading the Bible and studying it is good. But there's something more important. I think one of the stories in my own life highlights this really well. It happened a number of years ago. I was down in Melbourne studying for my PhD in practical theology, and I was staying with my mum at the time. And during that week, I spoke to her really harshly, and I made her cry. So much for being the good daughter. And I remember in that moment feeling so deeply convicted by God. And God spoke to me and said, "Love your mother." And it occurred to me that in that moment, all of the knowledge about God that I had, all of the knowledge about Bible, all of the 12 or so years of theological study, a bachelor and a master's and now a PhD, all of that came to nothing if I didn't listen to what God was saying and follow it. I remember calling my friend and confessing it and saying, I need to learn to love my mum better. And we went on this journey of loving my mother. You see, how do we get to know God? Well, it comes by doing what God has said. Not just hearing about it, not just knowing about it, by actually doing it. See, there's a big gap between knowing something and doing it. I remember reading a study recently that was done by a group of psychologists, and they looked at some professors in ethics. These people knew a lot about how to behave and about ethical behavior. But then they started to look at their lives and they discovered things like these people were really bad at returning their library books. In other words, they didn't follow through on what they taught. It happens too sometimes as preachers and pastors. We can get up on the platform and deliver a really great sermon, but behind the scenes be committing a sin. See, Jesus said that those who love him do what he said. Knowing God is all about acting and living according to what God says. It's putting his words in practice. Jesus said that when we do that, we will build a life, we'll build a house that's on rock. And when the storms come, it won't fall down. But if we just hear those words and let them go, our life will be like a house on sand and it will fall down. As I've learned to love my mum, as I've grown in the areas of my weakness, I've started to know what it is more about the love of God. That's how it works. There's nothing wrong with theological knowledge. There's nothing wrong with head knowledge. We don't leave our brains at the door when we choose to follow Jesus. But the higher priority in knowing God is to live according to what he's saying to us, to listen to the Spirit, the continuing voice of Jesus, and to follow. I hope that's been a blessing for you today. For more on hearing God's voice and having your very own God Conversations, you can go to godconversations.com. We'll see you next time.